we're live.
All right. Jason, thank you. Brothers, again, I apologize for the technical difficulty, but welcome to the first live streamed meeting of the North Carolina Masonic Research Society, and we are thrilled to have Worshipful Brother Jason Richards to give us a presentation tonight on the Noachide legend. And what I would ask is that hold your questions to the end. Raise your hand or get my attention somehow. I'll unmute you. We'll ask some questions, have a Q&A. But as we get started, get your favorite beverage, your favorite smoke, and we'll roll. So, Worshipful Brother Jason, it is all you.
Great. Thanks so much, Brother Matt. I really appreciate the invite. I'm honored to be with you all this evening, and really excited about just the ability to spend some time with y'all and talk through, really my first big Masonic research problem. I've been given this presentation in one way, shape, or form now for, oh goodness, probably a good 4 years. So over half of my Masonic experience has revolved around changing this program and updating this program. And it really all started with a conversation I had with a past district deputy grand master shortly after I was raised. And I was sitting in lodge with this gentleman, and he made some throwaway comment that said, the Master Mason's degree wasn't even the original legend. There was a story of Noah that the Master Mason's degree was originally built on. Oh, I see Gary over there. I'm going to go talk to him. And so I was left as this young, impressionable, newly raised Master Mason with someone who just dropped this bomb of knowledge on me and then walked away. And was like, well, wait a second. You can't just leave that here, because of course we're taught that the pinnacle of at least a Blue Lodge Masonic experience is that myth around King Solomon's Temple and the Abrahamic legend, and that's really a capstone to Blue Lodge Masonry. And for someone just to say, actually, it's something before that was just really interesting and really neat. So that drove me into what's now been 4 years of research. And Robert and other folks will tell you they've seen this multiple times, and it's completely different every time, because I keep running down more and more rabbit holes and more research. So let's get into Diluvian origins, the influence of the Noachide flood myth on the Masonic third degree. So let's see. Trying to make it so that y'all can see me and the slides at the same time. We'll go over here. I like to start off the program with just a quote that everybody's familiar with. Freemasonry is a peculiar system of morality veiled in allegory and illustrated by symbols. And I start off that way because one, everybody knows that quote, and two, just because the foundation of Freemasonry is mythology and myth. And so, with King Solomon's Temple, we have the modern Masonic myth. And what you come to find out is, I throw mythos and allegory kind of in the same camp with each other, because if you look at the original meaning of the words, allegory, or rather myth, is a historical story that involves supernatural events, and allegories, of course, are tales or stories that have a deeper meaning. And what you find as you look at mythology, specifically oral traditions throughout history, they're very closely intertwined. Almost every oral tradition involves a historical story with supernatural events that you need to dig deep into to find the hidden meaning and the rationale and the deeper hidden truth for self-betterment. And that's really what Freemasonry is all about, is that self-betterment. So of course we're all familiar with the modern Masonic myth of King Solomon's Temple, but what I want to talk to you tonight about is another myth, which is the myth of Noah. And again, I'm throwing a myth out quite a bit. You need to understand that while in contemporary language, mythology seems to, when you think about like Greek mythology or Roman mythology, there's an inherent judgment as to the validity of that story. So we say, oh, that's just a myth. That's not really true. But if you look at the etymology of myth and mythos, there's actually no judgment there on the validity of the story. So just because I talk about the Noachide myth, it doesn't mean that I'm casting judgment as to whether or not that story did or did not happen. But we'll talk a little bit about that later. Instead, I'm looking at it as a historical story with supernatural events that, as you'll see further on in the presentation, we can take allegorically as a way to better ourselves. So quick note about oral traditions and dates. So I'm going to start off tonight with a survey of worldwide flood mythology. But I'm going to throw some dates out at you as well. And what you need to know, this is a little confusing. What you need to know is that the dates that I'm sharing are not the dates that the traditions originated. We actually, as historians, don't have a way to be able to figure that out. They are the dates as nearest we can tell, as far as historians are concerned, that those oral traditions were first written down. So I'm going to get all the way up through like the 1600s. And those oral traditions most likely predated those dates by several thousand years. We just have no way of knowing. So with that said, we're going to pick up with a survey of flood mythology, worldwide tales of aqueous destruction and redemption. So, of course, we're all pretty familiar with the Abrahamic or biblical account told in Genesis 6, or Genesis 6 to 9. Of course, it revolves around the story of Noah, his wife, his 3 sons, and their wives. Of course, man, by this time in the creation, is incredibly depraved. God they have fallen out of favor with God, and God, in all of his view of the earth, only finds Noah and his family to be righteous. So he warns Noah of an impending flood, tells Noah to gather animals into the ark, and to build an ark, gather animals into the ark. Noah does as God commands. God brings the floods down, wipes out everybody on the planet except for Noah. All the animals, still trying to figure out whether or not the fish died, but that's ponderings for another day. And Noah, his family are saved. The floodwaters recede. Noah comes out, offers a burnt offering to the Lord. There's a rainbow in the sky as a sign of the new covenant between God and man post-deluge. And so I'm going over these specific parts of the story I'm going through these specifically because they keep coming up again and again and again. And so one of the things that we have to understand is, when it comes to oral traditions, you have to understand that oral traditions are passed down from generation to generation to generation over thousands, if not tens of thousands of years. We really, as historians, don't have a way to know, because again, they're oral, so they die with that generation. And oral traditions are really, you can only trace them back, roughly 3 or 4 generations, if they're specifically oral, because then you start to lose them. And when you look at the Old Testament as really a collection of oral traditions, you'll see that discrepancies and internal inconsistencies exist even within the biblical flood account. So an example of this is when Noah is asked to bring, or commanded to bring, animals into the ark. How many does he bring? Does he bring 2 of each kind? Or does he bring 2 of each kind and 7 of the clean animals? And that's one of about 10 different places where there are 2 tellings of the same story that are internally inconsistent. We see this with the creation story in Genesis 1 as well, with Adam and Eve being made at the same time. God made them male and female, and then Eve being taken from Adam's rib. So a lot of what we're talking about today is a little squishy. So with that, I'm going to ask for you all to indulge me as I share a quick clip of one of my favorite retellings of a part of the flood story that we don't get to see very often. Really, please install the Zoom audio device. All right, come. There we go. And this is the problem with live shows. It doesn't always work quite as we have planned. All right, put my headphones back in. Hopefully you all were able to hear that a little bit. That's from Neil Gaiman's and Terry Pratchett's miniseries, Good Omens, and just gives you a little bit of context for these different flood myths, where you have all of these different people searching for meanings and searching for the reason why God would let this incredible destruction come upon them. And so let's get into some of the earliest extant, or the oldest extant flood myths. Of course, extant being the oldest accounts that we actually know about. And again, you'll see the dates on the screen, because these are the dates that we believe through carbon dating and other contextual means that these accounts were actually written down. So of course, going over to the far right, 1700 years before the Common Era, we have the oldest known flood account, which is the Atrahasis epic. It's a Sumerian Akkadian myth, and tablet 3 actually contains the flood story. Interestingly enough, if we go over all the way to the left, you'll see the 1300 BCE tablet is actually the Epic of Gilgamesh. Of course, the Epic of Gilgamesh is the oldest known written work that we have today. The reason why I don't have 2100 BCE up there for the Epic of Gilgamesh is because, of course, as historians, we have found several different versions of the Epic of Gilgamesh, and the oldest versions of the Epic of Gilgamesh don't actually include the flood story. So historians believe that the flood story was later added, probably appropriated from the Akkadian Atrahasis epic, into the Epic of Gilgamesh several hundred years later, so around the 1300 before Common Era time frame. So in going back to the right with the Atrahasis epic, of course, it revolves around the story of the gods create human beings to do all the work on earth for them, but human beings become so plentiful and noisy that they end up disturbing the gods' rest. So the gods plot to send a devastating flood. Of course, one of the gods who created the humans in the first place takes pity on them and instructs his servant, the wise king Atrahasis, and warns him of the coming flood, and tells him to build an ark, and seal 2 of every kind of animal within. Atrahasis enters the ark with his family and the animals. After 7 days, the flood ends and the waters recede, and Atrahasis and his family are saved. If we move to the middle, the Atrahasis epic was kind of appropriated into the later Eridu Genesis, which is the Sumerian flood story, or rather the Sumerian creation story, written approximately again 1600 BCE. It's a similar tale to the Atrahasis epic, with Zasudra, who is an enlightened king and priest. And it unfolds in a very similar manner to the Atrahasis epic. And then finally, we get to, of course, the most famous of the Sumerian and Mesopotamian myths on the far left, the Epic of Gilgamesh. And this is interesting because the Epic of Gilgamesh is this entire long story, and the recounting of the flood story is almost kind of a subplot within the Epic of Gilgamesh. The idea is that Gilgamesh is looking for the secret to immortality. So he goes to Utnapishtim, who was the Mesopotamian Noah flood survivor, who survived the flood and was granted immortality because of that. Utnapishtim actually recounts the entire flood story, or at least fragments of it, to Gilgamesh. So moving on from the Babylonian, Sumerian, and Akkadian myths, we get up to about 500 years before Common Era with the Hindu flood mythology. So interestingly enough, in the Hindu holy books, there are 4 different traditions of a catastrophic flood story. I'm going to talk about one of them today, but again, you're seeing this conglomeration of oral histories that all share some details, but then have other things specific to that culture or that particular place that those stories were in use. So the main flood story in Hindu mythology, it works with the story of the Pralaya, which is the Great Flood, wherein the avatar of Vishnu warned the first man ever, Manu, of an impending flood. So the avatar of Vishnu came to Manu as a small fish, and Manu took pity on the fish and saved the fish from being eaten by others, and the fish grew and grew and grew, and as a thank you, the fish warned Manu about the impending flood and said, collect the 6 sages as well as seeds from every plant and animals and build a boat to contain them. And when the floodwaters come, I, the great Vishnu, now the huge fish that you see here in this relief painting, guided Manu and those sages to safety. Moving a bit closer to excuse me, to modern times, we get to the Greek and Roman accounts, which range from about 200 years before the Common Era to 200 years afterward. And I kind of lumped them together because really, for the most part, the Romans just appropriated Greek culture. So we've got the Bibliotheca, or library account of Deucalion in the 2nd century Common Era by Pseudo-Apollodorus, as well as Ovid's Metamorphoses, written about 8 years Common Era. And the story unfolds with of course, we have Prometheus, who is a demigod or god who creates man and mankind and gives him fire. Of course, Prometheus is punished by Zeus for that. But the first men grew up to be known as the Pelagians, and they were exceedingly wicked. So again, you have this total depravity of man thing happening. Lycaon, the king of Arcadia, wished to test the god's omniscience, specifically Zeus's omniscience. So what he did was he offered Zeus a burnt offering made from his own son. So he was trying to trick Zeus into committing cannibalism. Of course, Zeus saw through the act and was so enraged that he sent a flood to wipe out all of mankind. Of course, Prometheus warned Deucalion about the pending flood, instructed him to build a chest, and Deucalion and his wife Pyrrha were saved in the chest. After floating for 9 days and nights, they landed on Parnassus, where whereupon they gave a burnt offering to Zeus. Again, you can start to see, interconnectedness throughout the past several thousand years of flood stories, and had a renewed covenant with Zeus because of that. And interestingly enough, when you look at this painting, what Deucalion and his wife are actually doing is they are taking stones and throwing them over the backs of their heads, and those stones are actually morphing into the new race of mankind that we have today. So now we're getting into some of the fun mythology. So I absolutely love Norse mythology, and it's such a shame because I think scholars estimate that we've only barely scratched the surface of Norse mythology. We really don't know hardly anything about it. But the main work of Norse mythology is the Prose Edda, which was a work of literature that's the fullest and most detailed extant source of Germanic mythology. And I love Norse mythology because they take the testosterone level of other oral traditions and they crank it up to 11. So the Norse flood story revolves around the personage of Bergelmir, who was the grandson of Ymir, of course, who was the great famous frost giant. And so when Odin rose up to kill the giant Ymir, who was Bergelmir's grandfather, he drowned the entire world except for Bergelmir and his wife in a flood, a worldwide catastrophic flood of blood. And you only find that in Norse mythology because, again, they just take the testosterone dial and crank it up as far as it'll go. So that's an interesting little anecdote that I like to throw in here, just because it's the most unique, I think, of the flood stories that we talk about. So again, we're getting closer to modern times with Mesoamerican flood mythology, first written down approximately 1600 years Common Era. Again, we don't know how long this tradition was passed down. It's probably passed down for upwards of several thousand years. So as far as Aztec flood mythology is concerned, we have the story of a man named Tapi who lived a long time ago. He was a pious and righteous man, and the creator told him to build a boat that he would live in. He was told that he should take his wife and a pair of every animal that was alive into that boat. Of course, everyone thought that he was crazy, but the rain started and the flood came. And when the floods finally receded, Tapi and his family and the animals were able to disembark from the boat. He knew that the flood had receded because he released a dove into the air, which did not return to him. So moving into South America, further south, you get to find some more cultural influences, which are really neat. From about 1580 to about 1615 Common Era, we have a really neat flood story that revolves around the period of time called the Pachacama. And during this time of Pachacama, humans on Earth became very, very corrupt, very evil. Again, total depravity of man. And it was only the farmers living high up in the mountains who remained unsullied and righteous. And so these farmers started noticing that their llamas, who lived up in the mountains, were acting very, very strange. And because this is oral tradition, animals can talk. We've all watched Disney. So two brothers who were farmers asked their llamas why they were acting so strangely. And the llama said, well, these stars at night told us that a great flood was coming and the flood was going to destroy all life on Earth. So the brothers took their families and flocks into a cave high on the mountains, and it started to rain and continued raining for 4 months. As the water rose up, the mountains actually kept growing up out of the water, and eventually the rain stopped and the waters receded, and the mountain returned to its original height and man went forth. But the llamas, remembering the flood story, decided to stay in the mountains, which is why in South America the llamas are primarily found at higher altitudes. So an interesting note about African flood mythology is that they're compared with the rest of the world, there are very few culturally original, almost, if as it were, flood myths. Most of the flood myths that you find coming out of the continent of Africa are holdovers from the 1800s colonialism period, because they, by and large, most of them are the Noachide story or the Abrahamic account. But there are some really interesting ones out of Nigeria and Cameroon. The one in Nigeria talks about Obatala, who is the god of the sky and the creator of mankind, and as well as the founder of the first Yoruba city called Ife. And people built huts as Obatala had done, and Ife prospered and became a city. And all the gods were really happy about this, except for Olokun, who is actually the ruler of everything below the sky. And so Olokun had not been consulted about these humans living in her domain. And so Olokun sent a massive flood to wipe out everybody on the earth. The humans, seeing the rain come, of course, appealed to the gods, and Obatala came down to himself to wash the floodwaters away and save his chosen people. So this has been really a relatively quick relatively quick survey of flood mythologies and oral traditions across the entire world. It's really interesting because every continent and every civilization has a historical historical oral tradition revolving some sort of localized or global catastrophic flood. And I say every place, every continent except Antarctica, because nobody lives there. But as we take a look at these stories and these oral traditions that are literally continents and oceans apart, you start to see some interesting commonalities come to bear. The idea of an initial human transgression or total depravity of man. You have an enlightened few, you have destruction by water, you have divine salvation sealed with a new covenant with God, and then repopulation. And so it leads us to ask the question, why do these commonalities exist? There has to be a purpose behind it. And so one of the things I do like to talk about is Plato's idea of the lost continent of Atlantis. It's one of those what if scenarios of, well, could the reason for these connected oral traditions have been an actual sinking of a lost civilization or continent? And if so, why not Atlantis? Atlantis, according to Plato, was said to have been ruled over by Poseidon. He divided Atlantis out into 10 concentric zones, and Poseidon had 10 children, and so each child ruled over one of the zones in Atlantis, excuse me. And Atlanteans prospered and flourished. They mastered all of the crafts, including masonry. And they just prospered and prospered and prospered for generations. But then man got greedy, and man decided that Atlantis wasn't enough. The Atlanteans actually wanted to conquer the entirety of the known world. And so Zeus stepped in, held a meeting with all of the gods, and said, this can't happen. That is where, of course, Timaeus, the Platonic dialogue Timaeus ends, and then Marcellus picks it up with Atlantis being destroyed and a complete and utter deluge and sunk in one day. And so that's perhaps a common mythological origin, but let's talk a little bit about the science before we get into the real reason why everybody's here, which is, what does this have to do with Masonry? So talking a little bit about geomorphological evidence. I've been reading a book called Underworld by Graham Hancock, and that's where I got most of the science behind this presentation. And if you're interested in a 1,000-page read that is incredibly detailed but absolutely amazing, Graham Hancock is the way to go. So geomorphology, what is it? It's simply the scientific study of topographic features. So it's essentially scientists trying to figure out, what does the earth actually look like? Why do we have rivers? Why do we have valleys? What's this Grand Canyon thing? Why is there ice, on the North Pole and Antarctica, and that's really what geomorphology is all about today. Scientists believe that the last glacial maximum was about 18,000 years ago. It was a time known as the maximum interglacial. The Flandrian interglacial is the stage name, or the name rather, given by geologists and archaeologists in the British Isles. Really, that formed the first part of the current geological era. So when we talk about the glacial maximum, the Flandrian interglacial is actually the melting of the ice sheets that brought us out of the last ice age about 11,000 years ago. And so what we've been able to speculate is that the sea levels today are actually several meters higher than they were about 10 to 12,000 years ago, when the ice sheets really started melting. Now that might seem like a lot, but a lot of this happened very gradually over several thousand years. So estimates are that the coastline moved inward by approximately a meter every 1,000 years, and so that's not going to cause a lot of catastrophic flooding. But what we do know is that there is something called a glacial lake outburst flood. So when you have an ice sheet, a huge ice sheet that melts, sometimes the ice forms a dam, and the ice behind the dam melts and builds up pressure and pressure and pressure until the dam fails catastrophically. And that's what's called an outburst flood. So my speculation is if we had a glacial maximum approximately 18,000 to 2,000 years ago that brought ice almost to the point of Southern Europe, Mediterranean, maybe even the Fertile Crescent. If this was a primary spot for early humans to live, we might have oral traditions of catastrophic floods that came out of the breakdown in global warming that is associated with the end of the last ice age. And again, it's speculative at this point, but we do have the science indicating, when we believe those ice ages occurred. But it's just something interesting to think about as we ponder why every culture on the face of the planet has a catastrophic flood oral tradition. It's just really, really interesting. I feel like it has to have some foundation in science. I just haven't figured out quite what that is yet. So, all right, enough with the mythology and the science stuff. What does any of this have to do with Freemasonry? So in order to answer that question, we have to start with the craft guilds. I personally am of the opinion that Freemasonry and speculative Masonry today evolved from the craft guild system. You can trace that somewhat in Scotland, and that's a whole nother presentation I do, and that takes like an hour. We don't have time for that today. But if we go back to the 1500s, about the 1530s, we know that in York and the British Isles, all of the 48 craft guilds got together twice a year and performed mystery plays. And these were plays put on by each of the guilds that acted out scenes from the Bible. And we know that there were two specific craft guilds that each put on a play revolving around the story of Noah. The shipwrights performed the building of the ark, and the fishers and mariners performed Noah and his wife. It's interesting enough that we get into the time of James Anderson and his constitutions, and Noah is actually considered by many of our foundational Masonic writers to be a Mason. He just didn't work in stone, he worked in gopher wood. So we can see that the craft guild system out of which Masonry, speculative Masonry, likely arose was very familiar with the story of Noah and his wife. So when we get into further into the old charges, of course, we have the constitutions, Anderson's constitutions, where he talks about a Mason being obliged by his tenure to observe the moral law as a true Noachide. He also talks about Noah and his sons being all Masons true, again with the idea that Noah is actually a Mason himself and a builder, just not perhaps in stone. But when we get to the really interesting old charge, it's written approximately 1726, although it may have been written as early as 1626. Historians really don't know, so they ascribe the date to the Graham manuscript, which is this really interesting document, as 1726. The Graham manuscript is interesting for a number of reasons. First and foremost, it is the oldest known and first known account of a Masonic raising. So I like to say the original, we don't have any innovations in Masonry, but the third degree was actually the original invention in Masonry, because the craft guilds mostly only had the entered apprentice degree, and then as time went on, they had a fellow of the craft degree. But craft Masonry, especially in Scotland, generally consisted of just the 2 degrees, and the third degree really didn't come about until after the foundation of the premier Grand Lodge in England, as far as we can tell. So the Graham manuscript comes about in 1726. It predates the first known account of the Abrahamic legend by 4 years. First known account is in Pritchard's Masonry Dissected, which is the first known Masonic expose that actually put all the rituals together and just kind of threw them out for everybody to see. Caused quite a stir, as we might expect. Another interesting piece of the Graham manuscript is a part of it. It's in a catechism format, as a lot of the old charges are, and one part of the catechism revolves around the search of Noah's sons to find the body of their deceased father, to find the secret that he contained. And there are very striking similarities in this account to our contemporary Master Mason's degree. So we have a quest for this knowledge or this secret that was lost due to an untimely death. They actually find the grave and they attempt to raise their father by 3 distinct grips, finger, wrist, elbow. When they can't do that, they actually raise him up and put him on different points of the body. When they're unable to do so, they invoke the name of deity. So, what shall we do? Let us pray. And then when they realize that they can't find that secret, they invoke a substitute for that secret, because they realize that it's not the actual secret itself, but it's what the secret represents that will make them good men and honorable men in the sight of God. And it's from this little manuscript, it's just so interesting because of these similarities to our contemporary legend. We have further evidence of that the Abrahamic legend and the Noachide legend were actually worked in craft and warrant lodges about the same time. And the reason is, as Desagoulier and his followers were working to build out speculative masonry and bring it to the masses with the Abrahamic legend, there was a mock advertisement that was run in the local paper in Britain to give notice to all masons who have been made after the antediluvian manner. So talking about a Noahide type of legend. And specifically in here, this mock advertisement calls out innovations that have been lately introduced by the doctor, which scholars believe was a colloquialism for Desagoulier, the writer of the primary author of the Abrahamic legend. So what we see out of this advertisement is that you have a growing rift between Masons, those who are brought up with this grand manuscript type of Noachide legend for the third degree, and then the followers of Désagoulier who specifically revolve their legend around the King Solomon's Temple and the fallen builder. And so it's just a really interesting piece of Masonic history. We don't know what came first. We can speculate that that perhaps the Noachide account was an early form of the third degree that Désagoulier may have appropriated and may have worked into the story of King Solomon's Temple, but we really just as historians don't know. So it leads us to ask the question, why would the story of Noah have been used as the capstone or hallmark for speculative Masonry? And when you look at the story of Noah, you find that the flood mythology really models the initiatic experience very well. We start with a rude, corrupt, and unenlightened state, and that's pre-initiation. You have an enlightened priest, protagonist, enlightened few searching for enlightenment. Those are the candidates who arrive at the door of the lodge looking for light. You have a cleansing initiation that washes away the old, and you have a new enlightened state post initiation that is sealed with a divine covenant before God. And these five things are all hallmarks of Noahide flood mythology and really flood mythology throughout the entire world. And it really models, almost the hero's journey very, very well. There's also an alchemical context, borrowing some work from Brother Tim Hogan. The Noahide story really fits well into the alchemical system. You have an antediluvian world obsessed with the material senses. That's the earth stage. You have a cleansing initiatic flood, which sweeps away the old and sweeps away the profane. That's the water stage. You have the distillation stage, represented by the dove that's released post-deluge, and then finally the fire or calcination stage from the burnt offering upon exit from the ark, where all of the impurities are finally burned away. And those are two reasons why perhaps early Masons may have wanted to use the story of Noah or the story of Noah's virtuous secret as a capstone to their Masonic experience. Otherwise it may have been just because it was a story that they were all familiar with, going back to the 1500s and the craft guild system. Again, as historians, we can only speculate, and we really just don't know. So where is Noah in the Blue Lodge today? It's interestingly enough, the first time I ever gave this presentation was in Pennsylvania, at the Pennsylvania Academy of Masonic Knowledge. And I threw up this slide and said, yeah, so we've got these great symbols, the anchor and the ark, and everybody looked at me with they were deers in my headlights. And then, one nice brother came up to me afterward and he was like, we don't have those here. But I'm hoping that most of the folks here are familiar with these symbols, of course, symbols of well-founded hope and a well-lived life. And so Noah also factors very well and very prominently elsewhere in Freemasonry, specifically in the Allied Masonic degrees, which have 2 degrees devoted to him, the Commander Noah and the Royal Ark Mariner. It also factors into Rainbow for Girls, and then the Scottish Rite Southern jurisdictions, Noahide or Prussian Knight degree. And that's where Noah stands today. We ultimately don't know why speculative Masonry went the route of the fallen builder in King Solomon's Temple, vice the story of Noah after his death, and we'll probably never know. But what we can tell from the artifacts that we have and the old charges we have is that the myth of Noah was clearly an influence on the development of the third degree. Early craft Masons were familiar with the tale. They were God-fearing Christians, and they had a guild system that worked mystery plays. Noah was an attractive protagonist. He was a blameless builder. arguably a Mason, upon which one could really model desired behaviors and virtues. And the story of the flood really models that initiatic experience very well that Masonry is really built on today. We don't know why Masonry ended up the way it does, but if nothing else, this is a really interesting little glimpse into our history and where we came from. And perhaps if we know a little bit more about where we can, then try to have a really good impact on where we're going. And with that, Brother Matt, I will turn it right back over to you. And we unmute everybody's mics and everybody's snoring. Love it.
No, that was phenomenal. I can't wait to go back and watch the replay of this. Brothers, does anyone have any questions for Jason?
Yeah, I have some thoughts. I thought that was amazing. Really, really good video, Brother Jason.
Thanks, Jeremy.
And yeah, I mean, I think I was thinking the alchemy slide in and of itself, could be a whole presentation right there, that whole process, and the symbolism of that transformational process that comes about by the flood. And it reminds me of sort of like almost in the psychological sense, sort of our own breaking points, we come to, like God pushes us into all these circumstances and conditions to the point where we have to change at some point. And that's sort of that rebirth process. So anyway, I guess that's more of a point, but one question I had was about Desaguliers or whatever. Was he a Rosicrucian? Because there's some Rosicrucians that say it was them that injected the Abrahamic myth into the craft before the Noah legend.
So Rosicrucianism really hit its peak around the 1630s in Germany. It was about 100 years before Desaguliers. I don't know if he was a practicing Rosicrucian or not. It wouldn't surprise me because Masonic ritual and Masonic tenets are a hodgepodge of all of the good ideas that the Enlightenment ever had, and that includes Rosicrucianism from the standpoint of a return to ritualistic Christianity. So I just don't know enough about Desaguliers himself. We know ultimately very, very little about the formation of the third degree. We know it was attributed to Desaguliers and other unknown partners, but we don't necessarily know when, why, or how it came about outside of Pritchard just throwing it out for everybody in 1730. See, I love doing this presentation because my answer to just about anybody is the same, which is, I don't know.
Hey, I've got a question for you, Jason.
Sure.
First of all, let me comment that I'm enjoying watching everybody's video. This is the way to meet, man. Everybody's sitting here drinking a beer, having a glass of wine. Yeah, this rocks. This is good. Appreciate your time, Jason. This has been good stuff. Curious to know the 1,000-page Graham Hancock book. What's that? Everybody's taking a drink at the same time.
So
what's the name of that book?
The name of the book is Underworld.
Underworld. Okay.
And it's Graham Hancock's exploration of lost civilizations on the edges of various continents, to include India. So he actually learned how to scuba dive, and he took several excursions exploring ruins that are sitting 100 meters below the surface of the water.
Great, thank you.
Yep.
And Jason, if I could jump in on that, Sean, that was a great question. And as far as Hancock goes, he has a whole series of books where he's analyzing this, starting with Fingerprints of the Gods, Underworld, Magicians of the Gods, Heaven's Mirror. But he has just a slew of books that are all aimed in that direction, or that field of study. Just some fascinating research. He cites a lot of good science and quotes a lot of professionals in their field. So the one thing I like about Hancock is he doesn't say this is exactly what happened or this is fact. He says here's what the evidence says, and allows the reader to make up their own mind. So I highly recommend, anyone here picking up some of Graham's books, because they're phenomenal and entertaining.
Yeah, the trick is to finish them because they're all like over 1,000 pages long.
Graham's wordy, but it's good.
Yeah.
Jason, have you ever thought of when you finished your compilation, and you said a couple times that it's changed as you've given this presentation, to list for the participants the list of literature that you did research, so that if they want to go back to say, hey, I really like that point. Have you ever thought of making like a little bit of an amendment in the back from appendices to say, here's kind of the places I read, and, kind of like your book list you've done before? Just thinking out loud.
No, and that's a really good idea. I have most of that down, and that's the history major in me. You always cite your sources. So I've got most of them. Honestly, I ended up doing a lot of this research as internet research, going to different repositories of folklore and oral traditions, and then got some really good information from the old charges as primary sources. And then there was one of Art de Hoyos's books that I found that had the mock advertisement in it. I think it's one of his annotated biographies, but I'll check that. Yeah, it'll take some work for me to compile everything, but I need to do that at some point.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's something you need to do right away, but as we try to share and educate to people who are learning how to make their own presentations like this, I think it's always kind of nice to have a little bit of a blurb to say, where did you go from a source perspective. I know you're the history major, you and I have spoke before, so I'm leading the witness, and
Yep.
then that might help other people to understand where they can go to. And I think a lot of times when you're doing this type of research, people get overwhelmed. So how do you take it and just kind of put it in a bit of a box so they can take it and compartmentalize it and then read it later?
One bite of a time, and you add on to the ends, and that's how a 10-minute presentation goes to like an hour.
Hey, Jason, if I may,
Yeah.
thank you for a really fascinating presentation. This is a great way to spend an evening at home, and it's good to see all the brethren too. I was really interested in the Graham manuscript. Could you elaborate on that a little bit? Where did it come from? What else does it tell us? Any more light that you can shed on that, I would really appreciate it.
Sure. Let me see. I'm going to bring up actually the old charge. I'm going to bring up the old charges website, and I should have prefaced it with that because it's one of those like Yahoo GeoCities Angel Fire pages made in the 90s, and it has music that plays whenever you go to it. So let me share my screen with that. So let's see. I think it's around chapter 31. There we go. No, first try. The Graham manuscript. So you can find modern kind of transliterations. It's written in old English, but you have some modern translations, and it's really just a catechism, and it's a question and answer very similar to catechisms that we might have today. But there's one specific answer, and it's right here, and this is this big block of text. It talks about Shem, Ham, and Japheth going to their father Noah's grave to see if they could find anything about him that would lead them to his virtuous secret. And so you can see, so they reared up the dead body, supported it, setting foot to foot, knee to knee, breast to breast, cheek to cheek, and hand to back, and cried out, "Help us, O Father," as they said to their Father in heaven. And that's really that's actually kind of the capstone to the entire document is this long soliloquy of Noah's sons trying to find out their father's secret so that they too could be upright men in the face of God. And that's really what the Graham manuscript is in a nutshell. It's just a big catechism. You find that with a lot of the old charges and a lot of the documentation that we find in the, starting to pop up in about the 1600s, when it became when we had when we had more speculative Masons joining lodges. Those were the Masons who were actually literate, and they began writing things down. So that's why a lot of the old charges, a lot of the oldest rituals that we have related to operative Masonry have started to come about in the 1600s, because that's when we believe that operative Masonry really started taking that turn to speculative Masonry and admitting non-operatives.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
You're welcome. What else? Hearing none.
I'm sorry, did somebody have a question?
I was going to say, hearing none, we'll turn it back over to Matt.
Yeah, thank you. Brothers, I want to thank Brother Jason for that fantastic presentation. Frankly, I was blown away. I've heard a lot of stories about a Noachide legend in the third degree, but I've never really understood or known the background of it. So I'm just, Jason, I'm very grateful for you agreeing to speak with us. I think I speak for everyone when I just say that is a fantastic, fantastic presentation. I can't wait to go back and watch the recording of it, because there's just so much there. I just need to absorb that. So brothers, this presentation was recorded. It will be posted online to the Refracted Light Facebook page. So you can go back, watch it again later. And brothers that couldn't make it onto the meeting can also go there and access that. So with that, I think we're all set. We're done.